The summer heat pressed down on Willowbrook Estates like a heavy blanket, making the perfectly manicured lawns shimmer in the afternoon sun. This wasn't just any neighborhood. Every house here costs more than most people would see in a lifetime. The driveways were filled with luxury cars that gleamed under the sun, and the gardens looked like they belonged in magazines. Children rode expensive bikes down the wide sidewalks, while their parents watched from air-conditioned comfort behind floor-to-ceiling windows. But beneath all this beauty, something ugly was growing. It had been building for months, maybe even years. The kind of tension that starts small and spreads like poison through a community until it touches everyone. Marcus Williams had lived in Willowbrook Estates for 3 years now. At 12 years old, he was one of only a handful of black children in the entire neighborhood. His father worked long hours at a job that Marcus didn't fully understand, but knew was important enough to afford them their beautiful home on Maple Street. His mother spent her days working from home, always on conference calls that seemed to stretch on forever. Marcus was a good kid. He got decent grades, helped his neighbors when they asked, and never caused trouble. He loved riding his bike around the neighborhood, especially in the evenings when the heat finally broke and a cool breeze would sweep through the streets. The boy had no idea that some people watched him with suspicion every time he pedaled past their homes. He didn't know that certain neighbors had started whispering about him at their weekend barbecues. To Marcus, Willowbrook Estates was just home, the place where he'd learned to ride his bike without training wheels. Mrs. Chen from down the street always waved at him from her garden, where he felt safe and happy. Richard Blackwood saw things very differently. At FIF, 8 years old, Richard had been the president of the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association for 6 years running. He took the job seriously, maybe too seriously. Richard believed that maintaining property values meant maintaining a certain image. He spent his days walking through the neighborhood, looking for violations. Grass that was too long. Cars are parked in the wrong spots. Children are playing too loudly. Anything that didn't fit his vision of perfection. Richard lived alone in the biggest house on the block, a massive colonial with white columns that made it look like a small mansion. His wife had left him 2 years earlier, taking their adult children with her. She'd said he'd become someone she didn't recognize anymore. Someone is angry and controlling. Someone who saw enemies everywhere he looked. Richard told himself she just didn't understand the responsibility he carried, the weight of keeping their community safe and valuable. The truth was that Richard had been struggling for a long time. His business had been failing slowly for years, eaten away by younger competitors who understood technology better than he did. His children rarely call anymore. His ex-wife had moved across the country and seemed happier without him. The only place where Richard still felt powerful was in his role as HOA president. Here, people had to listen to him. Here, his word mattered. But even that power felt threatened lately. Some of the newer residents had been questioning his decisions. They'd started showing up to meetings with complaints about his enforcement methods. They said he was too harsh, too quick to fine people for minor violations. A few had even suggested it was time for new leadership. Richard could feel his control slipping away, and it terrified him more than he wanted to admit. The neighborhood itself seemed to reflect these hidden tensions. On the surface, everything looked perfect. The streets were clean, the houses were beautiful, and the crime rate was practically zero. But if you looked closer, you might notice how some neighbors avoided eye contact with others, how certain families never attended the community events, how conversations would stop abruptly when the wrong person walked by. There were unspoken rules in Willowbrook Estates that went far beyond what was written in the HOA handbook. Rules about who belonged and who didn't. About what kind of behavior was acceptable and what crossed invisible lines. These rules had never been discussed openly, but everyone seemed to understand them. Everyone except Marcus Williams, who was still young enough to believe that being a good person was enough to earn acceptance anywhere. The Williams family had moved to Willowbrook Estates with such hope. They'd saved for years to afford the down payment on their dream home. They'd imagined their son growing up in a safe, beautiful neighborhood where he could focus on his studies and make lifelong friends. They'd pictured themselves becoming part of a community that would support and protect their family. What they didn't know was that their arrival had already begun to shift the delicate balance of power in ways that would soon explode into violence. The stage was set for a confrontation that would expose the ugly truth hiding beneath Willowbrook Estate's perfect surface. And at the center of it all was a 12-year-old boy who just wanted to ride his bike in peace, completely unaware that his very presence had become a threat to someone who would stop at nothing to maintain control. The first real incident happened on a Tuesday evening in late June. Marcus was riding his bike down Elm Street, taking his usual route through the neighborhood, when Richard Blackwood stepped directly into his path. The boy had to brake hard, his tires skidding slightly on the hot asphalt. "You need to slow down," Richard said, his voice sharp and commanding. "This isn't a racetrack." Marcus looked confused. He hadn't been going fast at all, just pedaling at his normal pace. "Sorry, Mr. Blackwood. I didn't think I was going too fast." "Well, you were. And another thing, you've been cutting through the Hendersons' yard. That's private property." The boy's confusion deepened. He'd never cut through anyone's yard. He always stayed on the sidewalks and streets, just like his parents had taught him. "I don't think I've done that, sir. I always stay on the sidewalk." Richard's eyes narrowed. Something about the boy's polite response seemed to irritate him even more. "Don't lie to me, son. I've seen you. Multiple times." Marcus felt his stomach twist with anxiety. He wasn't lying, but he could see that Mr. Blackwood didn't believe him. The man's face was red, and there was something in his eyes that scared the 12-year-old. "I'm really sorry if I did something wrong. I'll be more careful." "You better be. I'm watching you." That night, Marcus told his parents about the encounter. His father, David Williams, felt a familiar knot form in his stomach. He'd experienced this kind of thing before, growing up in a different time and place. He'd hoped his son would never have to face it, especially not in a neighborhood like this one. "Did you do anything he said you did?" David asked gently. "No, Dad. I promise. I always stay on the sidewalk like you taught me." David believed his son completely. Marcus had never been a liar, and he was usually very careful about following rules. But David also knew that sometimes the truth didn't matter when certain people had already made up their minds about you. "Just keep doing what you're doing," David told his son. "Stay on the sidewalks, be respectful, and try to avoid Mr. Blackwood if you can." But avoiding Richard Blackwood was becoming impossible. The man seemed to be everywhere Marcus went. When the boy rode his bike to the community pool, Richard was there, watching him from across the parking lot. When Marcus played basketball at the small court near the playground, Richard would walk by multiple times, always staring. It felt like being followed, and it made Marcus nervous in a way he'd never experienced before. The second incident happened 2 weeks later. Marcus was walking home from his friend Tyler's house when he heard someone shouting behind him. He turned to see Richard Blackwood jogging toward him, his face flushed with anger and exertion. "Hey, stop right there!" Marcus froze, his heart starting to race. He'd been walking on the sidewalk, not bothering anyone. He couldn't think of anything he'd done wrong. "Where are you coming from?" Richard demanded when he reached the boy. "Tyler's house, sir. We were working on a school project." "Tyler Morrison? On Oak Street?" "Yes, sir." Richard's eyes scanned Marcus from head to toe, like he was looking for evidence of some crime. "What's in your backpack?" "Just my school stuff and some snacks Tyler's mom gave me." "Open it." Marcus felt humiliated, but he was too scared to refuse. He unzipped his backpack and showed Richard the contents: a notebook, some pencils, a water bottle, and a bag of cookies that Mrs. Morrison had packed for him. Richard examined everything carefully, as if he expected to find stolen goods. When he found nothing suspicious, his expression grew even angrier. "Next time, I want you to use the main entrance to the neighborhood when you're visiting friends. Don't cut through the side streets." Marcus had used the main entrance. He always did. But he didn't dare contradict the man again. "Yes, sir." Word of these encounters began to spread through the neighborhood, but the reactions were mixed. Some residents, like the Morrisons and the Chens, were disturbed by Richard's behavior. They'd known Marcus for years and found him to be a polite, well-behaved child. They couldn't understand why Richard was targeting him. But others seemed to support Richard's vigilance. At the monthly HOA meeting in July, several residents praised him for keeping a close eye on things and maintaining neighborhood security. They spoke in code, never mentioning Marcus by name, but everyone knew what they meant. "We moved here for the safety and the property values," said Janet Hoffman, who lived 3 houses down from the Williams family. "We need to make sure certain elements don't change the character of our community." Richard felt validated by this support. It confirmed what he'd been thinking all along, that he was the only one brave enough to address the real problems in Willowbrook Estates. The boy was just the beginning. If they didn't take a stand now, who knew what kind of people would start moving in? But Richard's obsession with Marcus was taking a toll on his own life. He'd started spending hours each day patrolling the neighborhood, looking for violations and watching for the boy. His business was suffering even more as he neglected clients and missed important meetings. His few remaining friends had stopped calling because every conversation turned into a rant about neighborhood security and property values. The truth was that Richard's hatred wasn't really about Marcus at all. It was about everything he'd lost and everything he feared losing. His marriage, his children's respect, his business success, his sense of control over his own life. The boy had become a symbol of all the changes Richard couldn't accept, all the ways the world was moving forward without him. Meanwhile, Marcus was changing too. The confident, happy child who'd moved to Willowbrook Estates was becoming anxious and withdrawn. He'd stopped riding his bike as much, afraid of running into Mr. Blackwood. He'd started taking longer routes to avoid certain streets. He'd even asked his parents if they could move somewhere else, though he couldn't fully explain why. David and Sarah Williams were watching their son's transformation with growing alarm. They'd worked so hard to give him a safe, stable childhood, and now they were seeing him lose his innocence in real time. David had started documenting Richard's behavior, keeping notes about each incident and even taking photos when he could. He had a feeling they might need evidence someday. The breaking point came in early August. Marcus was playing with Tyler Morrison and 2 other neighborhood kids in the small park at the center of Willowbrook Estates. They were just throwing a football around, laughing, and enjoying the last weeks of summer vacation. The park was a public space, clearly marked as a community area in all the HOA documents. Richard appeared suddenly, striding across the grass with purpose. "You kids need to move along," he announced. Tyler looked confused. "Why? We're not doing anything wrong. This area is for residents only." "We are residents," said Emma Chen, Tyler's neighbor. "We all live here." Richard's gaze fixed on Marcus. "Not all of you." The other children looked at Marcus, then back at Richard, trying to understand what was happening. Marcus felt his face burn with shame and anger. He lived here just as much as any of them did. His family paid the same HOA fees, followed the same rules, and took care of their property just like everyone else. "I live here too," Marcus said quietly. "We'll see about that," Richard replied. "I'm going to be checking into your family's residency status. There are rules about who can live in this community." That night, David Williams made a phone call he'd been dreading. He called his brother James, who worked for the FBI in Washington, D.C. David had never wanted to use his family connections to solve problems, but this situation was escalating beyond what he could handle alone. "I need some advice," David told his brother. "There's a man here who's been harassing Marcus. It's getting worse, and I'm worried about where this is heading." James Williams listened to his brother's story with growing concern. As an FBI agent, he'd seen how these situations could spiral out of control. He'd also seen how racial harassment could escalate into violence when left unchecked. "Document everything," James advised. "Every interaction, every threat, Every incident. And David, if this man puts his hands on Marcus, you call me immediately. I don't care what time it is. But Richard Blackwood had no idea who he was really dealing with. In his mind, the Williams family was just another obstacle to overcome, another problem to solve through intimidation and control. He'd started making plans, researching HOA bylaws and looking for any technicality he could use to force them out of the neighborhood. The other residents of Willowbrook Estates were beginning to choose sides, though many didn't realize it yet. Some were quietly supporting the Williams family, disturbed by Richard's increasingly erratic behavior. Others were rallying behind Richard, convinced that he was protecting their community from some unnamed threat. The tension was building towards something explosive, and everyone could feel it. The question wasn't whether something terrible would happen, but when and how bad it would be. Marcus Williams, still just a child trying to enjoy his summer vacation, had become the center of a storm that was about to tear apart the perfect facade of Willowbrook Estates forever. The morning of August the 15th started like any other summer day in Willowbrook Estates. The sun was already beating down by 9 o'clock, promising another scorching afternoon. Marcus Williams had finished his breakfast and was getting ready to meet Tyler at the community pool when his mother reminded him to take his bike to the repair shop first. The chain had been slipping for weeks, and she didn't want him riding an unsafe bike. Marcus loaded his bike into the back of their SUV, and his mother drove him to Peterson's bike shop on the other side of town. The repair would take about an hour, so Sarah Williams decided to run some errands while they waited. She dropped Marcus off with $20 for the repair and told him she'd pick him up in an hour and a half. "Just wait inside the shop if I'm a few minutes late," she said, kissing his forehead. "Don't wander around at this area by yourself." Marcus nodded and waved as she drove away. He'd been to Peterson's before, and Mr. Peterson was always nice to him. The shop was small and cluttered, filled with bikes in various stages of repair and the smell of oil and rubber. Marcus explained the problem with his chain, and Mr. Peterson assured him it would be an easy fix. "Should be ready in about 45 minutes, the older man said. "You can wait here if you want, or there's a little park across the street." Marcus decided to wait in the shop, reading a magazine about mountain biking while Mr. Peterson worked. But after 30 minutes, the heat in the small building became unbearable. The ancient air conditioner was struggling, and sweat was dripping down Marcus's back. "I'm going to get some air," he told Mr. Peterson, who was bent over his bike with a wrench. "Sure thing. Just stay where I can see you." Marcus stepped outside and immediately felt a slight breeze that was much cooler than the stuffy shop. He walked to the small park across the street, staying within sight of the bike shop like Mr. Peterson had asked. The park was just a tiny patch of grass with a few benches and a single tree that provided some shade. He'd been sitting under the tree for maybe 10 minutes when he heard a car door slam. Marcus looked up and felt his stomach drop. Richard Blackwood was walking toward him across the street, his face twisted with an expression Marcus had never seen before. It was beyond anger. It was something wild and dangerous. "What are you doing here?" Richard demanded as he reached the park. Marcus stood up quickly, his heart already racing. "My bike is getting fixed. My mum is coming to pick me up." "Your mum, huh? Where is she?" "She's running errands. She'll be back soon." Richard looked around the area, taking in the bike shop, the small businesses, and the fact that they were far from Willowbrook Estates. His eyes had a strange gleam in them, like he was calculating something. "You're lying," Richard said suddenly. "You don't live in our neighborhood. I've been checking, and there's no record of your family properly registering with the HOA. You've been trespassing this whole time." Marcus felt confused and scared. His parents had definitely registered with the HOA. He remembered them talking about the paperwork and the fees. "That's not true, Mr. Blackwood. We live at 247 Maple Street. We've lived there for 3 years. "Stop lying to me!" Richard's voice was getting louder, and Marcus could see people starting to look in their direction. "I know what you people are up to. Moving into neighborhoods where you don't belong, bringing down property values, changing everything." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. "You people? He'd heard those words before. Woo, whispered by kids at his old school, muttered by strangers in stores. But hearing them from someone in his own neighborhood, someone who was supposed to be a leader in his community, made them hurt in a way he'd never experienced. "I'm not doing anything wrong," Marcus said, his voice shaking. "I just want to go home." "That's the problem," Richard said, stepping closer. "It's not your home. It never was." Something in Richard's brain had snapped completely. Months of frustration, years of feeling powerless, decades of buried prejudice had all combined into a toxic rage that was now focused entirely on this 12-year-old boy. In Richard's twisted mind, Marcus represented everything that was wrong with his life, everything that was threatening his last bit of control. Marcus started backing away, but Richard grabbed his arm. The man's grip was tight and painful, and Marcus could smell alcohol on his breath, even though it was barely noon. "Let go of me," Marcus said, trying to pull away. "You're coming with me," Richard said. "We're going to settle this once and for all." Richard started dragging Marcus toward his car, a black sedan parked at the curb. Marcus tried to resist, but Richard was much bigger and stronger. The boy looked desperately toward the bike shop, hoping Mr. Peterson would see what was happening, but the older man was still bent over his workbench, focused on his repairs. "Help!" Marcus called out, but his voice came out as barely more than a whisper. Fear had closed his throat, making it hard to breathe, let alone scream. Richard shoved Marcus toward the car, fumbling for his keys with his free hand. "Get in the back seat, now." "No," Marcus said, finding his voice. "I'm not going anywhere with you." That's when Richard hit him. It was a backhanded slap across the face that sent Marcus stumbling backward. The boy's cheek exploded with pain, and he tasted blood in his mouth. "I said get in the car." Marcus looked around frantically. There were a few people on the street, but they were far away and didn't seem to notice what was happening. The bike shop was right there, but Mr. Peterson was still inside, unaware of the drama unfolding across the street. Richard grabbed Marcus again, this time by the back of his shirt, and started forcing him toward the open car door. Marcus could feel the fabric tearing as he struggled against the man's grip. "Stop fighting me, you little—" Richard's words were cut off as Marcus managed to break free and run. The boy sprinted toward the bike shop, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst. Behind him, he could hear Richard cursing and giving chase. Marcus burst through the door of the bike shop, gasping for breath. "Mr. Peterson! Help me! There's a man!" But Richard was right behind him. He grabbed Marcus by the shoulders and spun him around, his face red with exertion and rage. "This boy is a thief," Richard announced to Mr. Peterson, who had looked up from his work in confusion. "I caught him trying to steal from cars in the parking lot." "That's not true," Marcus cried. "He's lying. He tried to make me get in his car." Mr. Peterson looked back and forth between the man and the boy, trying to understand what was happening. Richard was well dressed and spoke with authority, but something was unsettling about his demeanor. Marcus was clearly terrified, and there was a red mark on his cheek that looked like it might be from a slap. "Maybe we saw—" "Who'd call the police," Mr. Peterson said carefully. "No need," Richard said quickly. "I'll handle this. His parents need to know what kind of kid they're raising." Richard's grip on Marcus's shoulders tightened, and the boy winced in pain. That's when Mr. Peterson made his decision. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to let go of the boy and leave my shop." Richard's eyes flashed with anger. "You don't understand. This kid is trouble. He doesn't belong in decent neighborhoods." "I understand perfectly," Mr. Peterson said, reaching for the phone behind his counter. "And I'm calling the police right now." The mention of the police seemed to snap Richard back to reality for a moment. He looked around the shop, suddenly aware of where he was and what he was doing. He released Marcus's shoulders and took a step back. "This isn't over," he said to Marcus, his voice low and threatening. "I know where you live. I know where you go to school. This isn't over." Richard turned and walked out of the shop, leaving Marcus shaking and Mr. Peterson dialing 911. Through the window, they watched Richard get into his car and drive away, but not before he sat there for a long moment, staring at the bike shop with an expression that promised this was far from finished. Marcus collapsed onto a chair, his whole body trembling. The red mark on his cheek was already starting to swell, and his shirt was torn where Richard had grabbed him. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the fear that was now consuming him. Richard Blackwood had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and somehow Marcus knew that this was only the beginning of something much worse. The police arrived at Peterson's bike shop within minutes of Mr. Peterson's call. Officer Maria Santos had been patrolling the area when the dispatch came through, and something about the description of events made her respond with unusual urgency. When she walked into the shop and saw Marcus Williams sitting in a chair with a swollen cheek and torn shirt, her training kicked in immediately. "Are you hurt anywhere else besides your face?" she asked gently, kneeling to Marcus's eye level. Marcus shook his head, but his hands were still trembling. "He said he was going to take me somewhere. He said this wasn't over." Officer Santos took detailed notes as Marcus recounted what had happened. Mr. Peterson provided his own account, describing how the man had claimed Marcus was a thief and had seemed agitated and possibly intoxicated. The officer took photos of Marcus's injuries and the torn shirt, treating the incident with the seriousness it deserved. "Do you know this man's name?" Officer Santos asked. "Richard Blackwood. He's the president of our HOA." The officer's eyebrows raised slightly. She'd heard that name before in connection with other complaints, though nothing this serious. "We're going to need to contact your parents right away." When Sarah Williams received the call, she was in the middle of grocery shopping. The words, "your son" and "assault" made her drop her phone, and she had to ask the officer to repeat everything twice before it sank in. She abandoned her cart in the middle of the store and drove to the bike shop faster than she'd ever driven in her life. The sight of her son's swollen face broke something inside Sarah Williams. Marcus had always been such a gentle child, never getting into fights, never causing trouble. To see him hurt and scared because of an adult's hatred was almost more than she could bear. "I'm so sorry, baby," she whispered, holding him close. "This should never have happened to you." David Williams arrived 20 minutes later, having left an important client meeting the moment Sarah called him. When he saw his son's condition, his hands clenched into fists. Every instinct told him to find Richard Blackwood and make him pay for what he'd done. But David was a smart man who understood that violence would only make things worse. Instead, he called his brother James. "It happened," David said simply when James answered. He put his hands on Marcus. James Williams was in his office at the FBI building in Washington when he got the call. As soon as he heard the details, he knew this case was going to be bigger than a simple assault charge. Richard Blackwood had just committed a federal hate crime against the son of an FBI agent, and the consequences were going to be severe. "I'm driving down there tonight," James told his brother. "Don't do anything until I get there. Let the local police handle the immediate response, but this is going federal." Meanwhile, Richard Blackwood had driven straight home after leaving the bike shop. He sat in his driveway for nearly an hour, his hands gripping the steering wheel as he tried to process what had just happened. Part of him felt justified. The boy had been disrespectful, had been where he didn't belong. But another part of him, a small voice he tried to ignore, knew he'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Richard went inside and poured himself a large glass of whiskey, even though it wasn't even 1 o'clock in the afternoon. He told himself he'd been protecting his community. He told himself the boy's parents would probably just move away quietly rather than cause trouble. He told himself everything would go back to normal. But when the police knocked on his door 3 hours later, Richard knew his life was about to change forever. "Richard Blackwood, you're under arrest for assault and battery, attempted kidnapping and civil rights violations," Officer Santos announced as she placed handcuffs on his wrists. The neighbors who had supported Richard's vigilance suddenly found themselves questioning everything they thought they knew. Janet Hoffman, who had praised his dedication to neighborhood security just weeks earlier, watched from her window as he was led away in handcuffs. The sight made her stomach turn with shame as she realized what she'd been supporting all along. "I had no idea it would go this far," she told her husband that evening. I thought he was just being thorough about HOA rules." But others in the neighborhood weren't so quick to abandon Richard. A small group of residents began organizing what they called a defense fund, claiming that Richard was being persecuted for trying to protect their community. They whispered about how the Williams family was playing the race card and how this would bring unwanted attention to Willowbrook Estates. The story broke in the local news within 24 hours. HOA president arrested for assaulting child was the headline that appeared on every local station and newspaper. But the reporters didn't know yet about Marcus's uncle or the federal investigation that was already beginning. Richard spent his first night in jail in a state of complete denial. He called his lawyer, a man who specialized in HOA disputes and property law, completely unprepared for criminal defense. Richard insisted that the charges were overblown, that he'd simply been trying to question a suspicious child, and things had gotten out of hand. "This will all blow over," he told his lawyer. "It's just a misunderstanding." But his lawyer, reading the police report and seeing the photos of Marcus's injuries, knew better. "Richard, you need to understand how serious this is. You assaulted a child. You tried to force him into your car. This isn't going away." The psychological toll on Marcus was immediate and severe. The confident, happy boy who had started the summer riding his bike around the neighborhood was now afraid to leave his house. He had nightmares about Richard Blackwood, waking up in cold sweats as he relived the moment when the man had grabbed him and tried to force him into the car. Sarah Williams found herself unable to concentrate on work, constantly checking on Marcus and jumping at every unexpected sound. The sense of safety she'd felt in Willowbrook Estates was completely shattered. How could they continue living in a place where their son had been targeted with such hatred? David Williams channeled his anger into action, working with his brother to ensure that Richard faced the full consequences of his actions. But he also struggled with guilt, wondering if he should have done more to protect his son from the escalating harassment. The community of Willowbrook Estates was fracturing along lines that had always existed, but had never been so clearly drawn. Some residents rallied around the Williams family, bringing meals and offering support. Others seemed to blame the family for bringing trouble to their peaceful neighborhood. Mrs. Chen, who had always waved at Marcus from her garden, now made a point of checking on the family daily. "That boy is an angel," she told anyone who would listen. "What happened to him is a disgrace to our community." But the Hoffmans and several other families began avoiding the Williams family entirely, as if the trauma Marcus had experienced was somehow contagious. The ripple effects extended far beyond Willowbrook Estates. Richard's business, already struggling, collapsed completely as clients learned about his arrest. His few remaining friends distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with someone who had assaulted a child. His ex-wife, reached by reporters, expressed shock, but said she wasn't entirely surprised. "Richard had been getting angrier and more paranoid for years," she said. "I tried to get him help, but he refused to admit there was a problem." As the initial shock wore off and the legal process began, one thing became clear. This wasn't just about one man's hatred or one family's trauma. It was about the ugly truths that lurked beneath the surface of communities across America, and how quickly those truths could explode into violence when left unchecked. The perfect facade of Willowbrook Estates had been shattered forever, and everyone who lived there would have to decide what kind of community they wanted to rebuild from the pieces. The federal charges came down 3 weeks after Richard Blackwood's arrest, and they hit like a thunderbolt through the quiet streets of Willowbrook Estates. What had started as a local assault case had become a federal hate crime investigation, complete with FBI agents interviewing neighbors and examining months of documented harassment. The revelation that Marcus Williams was the nephew of FBI agent James Williams sent shockwaves through the community and the media. Richard sat in his lawyer's office, staring at the federal indictment with disbelief. Assault and battery, attempted kidnapping, deprivation of civil rights under color of law, and conspiracy to interfere with housing rights. The charges carried a potential sentence of 15 to 20 years in federal prison. "How did this happen?" Richard asked his new lawyer, a criminal defense attorney who specialized in federal cases. "I was just trying to protect my neighborhood." The lawyer, Margaret Chen, looked at her client with a mixture of professional sympathy and personal disgust. She'd seen cases like this before, where prejudice and power had combined into something toxic and destructive. "Mr. Blackwood, the evidence against you is overwhelming. There are witnesses, photographs, and documented patterns of harassment going back months. The boy's uncle is an FBI agent who has been building a case against you since the harassment began. Your best option is to accept a plea deal." But Richard couldn't accept that his actions had been wrong. Even facing decades in prison, he continued to insist that he'd been protecting his community from people who didn't belong. The delusion that had driven him to assault a child was the same delusion that prevented him from understanding the gravity of his situation. The trial, when it finally came, lasted only 4 days. The prosecution presented a devastating case that included Marcus's testimony, Mr. Peterson's eyewitness account, photographs of the boy's injuries, and months of documented harassment. They painted a picture of a man whose hatred had escalated from verbal intimidation to physical violence, with clear intent to cause further harm. Marcus took the stand on the second day, his voice steady but quiet, as he recounted what Richard had done to him. The courtroom was silent, as the 12-year-old described being grabbed, slapped, and nearly forced into a car by a man who was supposed to be a community leader. "I was scared he was going to take me somewhere and hurt me more," Marcus testified. "He said it wasn't over, that he knew where I lived and where I went to school." Richard's defense attorney tried to argue that her client had been under extreme stress, that his business failures and personal losses had affected his judgment. But the prosecution's case was too strong, and Richard's own words and actions had created an undeniable pattern of racial harassment. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Richard Blackwood was sentenced to 18 years in federal prison, with no possibility of parole for the first 12 years. As the sentence was read, Richard finally seemed to understand what he had lost. His freedom, his reputation, his home, his remaining relationships, all destroyed because he couldn't accept that a black family belonged in his neighborhood. He broke down in the courtroom, sobbing as the reality of his situation finally penetrated the wall of denial he'd built around himself. The Williams family watched the sentencing with mixed emotions. Justice had been served, but the trauma Marcus had experienced couldn't be erased by a court verdict. The boy was in therapy, working through the fear and anxiety that Richard's actions had created. Some days were better than others, but the carefree child who had moved to Willowbrook Estates was gone forever. "I'm glad he can't hurt anyone else," Marcus told his parents after the sentencing, "but I still don't understand why he hated me so much. I never did anything to him." David and Sarah Williams struggled with how to answer their son's question. How do you explain centuries of systemic racism to a 12-year-old? How do you help a child understand that sometimes people's hatred has nothing to do with anything you've done and everything to do with who you are? The community of Willowbrook Estates was forever changed by what had happened. Some residents, horrified by Richard's actions and their own complicity in creating an environment where such hatred could flourish, began working to make their neighborhood more welcoming and inclusive. They organized diversity training sessions, created new policies for the HOA that explicitly prohibited discriminatory enforcement, and reached out to the Williams family with genuine apologies and support. But others simply moved away, unable to face the uncomfortable truths that Richard's crimes had exposed about their community and themselves. Property values in Willowbrook Estates dropped significantly as the story gained national attention, becoming a symbol of how racism could poison even the most affluent communities.